The wagon rolled to a stop at the edge of the Kansas prairie in April 1876. Most homesteaders who arrived that spring looked at the flat, treeless landscape and immediately started planning their timber cabins. They'd haul logs from the distant creek beds, or they'd buy expensive lumber from the railroad town 40 miles east. That's what everyone did. That's what made sense. But when Samuel Whitmore stepped down from his wagon and surveyed his 160-acre claim, he didn't look at the horizon, he looked down, at the south-facing hillside that rolled gently across his property, at the red clay soil, at the natural drainage, and he made a decision that would make him the laughingstock of the entire county. He was going to build his home inside that hill. The mockery started immediately. His nearest neighbor, a man named Jacob Sterling, whose claim bordered his to the east, rode over the day Samuel began digging. Sterling sat on his horse, watching Samuel mark out a rectangle on the hillside with wooden stakes, and he couldn't help himself. "You planning to live like a prairie dog, Whitmore?" Sterling asked. Samuel didn't look up from his work. "Planning to live warm," he replied. "In dirt?" Sterling laughed. "That's not a house, that's a grave you're digging for yourself. A house belongs above ground, not under it." "The house will be above ground," Samuel explained patiently. "It'll just also be in the ground, half and half." Sterling shook his head. "You're wasting your time, and you're wasting good homestead land. The government requires a proper dwelling, not a hole in the ground. They'll never accept that for proving up your claim." "Then I'll find out in 5 years," Samuel said, picking up his shovel. "In the meantime, I've got digging to do." The story spread quickly through the scattered homestead community. "That new fellow Whitmore, the one from Pennsylvania, he's building his house in a hillside like some kind of animal." Folks made special trips to see it. They stood on the prairie watching Samuel excavate his hillside, and they shook their heads in disbelief. Some thought he was crazy. Others thought he was lazy, trying to avoid the hard work of building a proper cabin. A few thought he simply didn't understand what homesteading required. Samuel Whitmore was none of those things. He was 34 years old, a coal miner's son from the mountains of Pennsylvania. He'd spent his childhood in a mining town where winter temperatures regularly dropped below zero, and summer heat baked the valley like an oven. But he'd also spent time in the mines themselves, and he'd noticed something that most men took for granted. 300 feet underground, the temperature never changed. Winter or summer, day or night, the temperature stayed at exactly 54 degrees Fahrenheit. This observation had stuck with him. When he decided to homestead in Kansas, he'd read everything he could about earth-sheltered construction. He'd learned about the ancient dwellings of the Pueblo people in the Southwest. He'd read accounts of settlers in Nebraska who'd built sod houses because timber was scarce. And he'd talked to an old German immigrant who told him about building partially underground in the old country. Samuel wasn't improvising. He was applying principles that had worked for thousands of years. But try explaining that to Kansas homesteaders in 1876 who were convinced the only proper house was a timber frame cabin or, if you had money, a proper wood frame house with milled lumber. The concept of intentionally building into the earth seemed backwards, primitive, the opposite of progress. Samuel understood their skepticism. He just didn't care. He'd done the calculations. He'd observed the land. He knew what he was doing. The site he'd chosen was perfect for his purposes. The hillside faced south, which meant it would receive maximum sunlight during the winter months when the sun was low in the sky. The slope was gentle enough to work with, but steep enough to provide good drainage. The soil was primarily clay with some sand, which meant it would compact well and resist erosion, and the hill itself was high enough that he wouldn't have to worry about flooding from the creek that ran through the valley below. Samuel began by excavating into the hillside, not straight in, but at a slight angle, cutting back about 24 feet into the hill. The excavation was 16 feet wide. He dug down approximately 8 feet from the original hillside surface, creating a rectangular pit that would become his living space. This was backbreaking work. Samuel worked alone, hour after hour, day after day, wielding a pickaxe and shovel. The clay soil was dense and heavy. Every bucketful had to be hauled out and dumped to the side. The work took him 6 weeks of steady labor. His neighbors watched the progress with a mixture of fascination and disdain. "Man's digging his own grave," they'd say, working himself to death for a hole in the ground. But Samuel kept digging. Once the main excavation was complete, Samuel began the structural work. This was where his design diverged from a simple dugout. He wasn't building a cave. He was building a hybrid structure that would use the Earth's natural insulation while still providing the light and ventilation of an above-ground home. He started by building a stone foundation wall along the front, the south-facing side of his excavation. He hauled stones from the creek bed, hundreds of them, and laid them up with clay mortar mixed with sand and prairie grass. This wall rose 8 feet high and was 2 feet thick at the base, tapering to 18 inches at the top. It was solid, substantial, designed to last. The stone wall served multiple purposes. It supported the roof structure. It provided thermal mass that would absorb heat during the day and release it at night. And it created a proper facade that made the structure look more like a conventional building from the outside, which Samuel hoped would satisfy the government inspectors when the time came to prove up his claim. Into this stone wall, Samuel set a heavy wooden door frame and 2 window frames. The door was positioned off-center. The windows flanked it, each one 30 inches wide and 40 inches tall. This was far more glass than most homestead cabins had. Glass was expensive and fragile. But Samuel understood that natural light was essential, especially in a structure that was partially underground. The windows would also serve as passive solar collectors, allowing winter sun to penetrate deep into the space. The side walls of his excavation, the north, east, and west walls, were simply the excavated earth face, but Samuel didn't leave them raw. He cut them back at a slight angle, creating a more stable profile that was less likely to collapse. Then he lined them with a mixture of clay and sand, smoothing it like plaster. This created a more finished surface and helped seal the walls against moisture infiltration. Over this clay plaster he applied a thin layer of lime wash, which he mixed from lime he'd purchased in town. The lime wash brightened the interior and had natural antimicrobial properties that would help prevent mold. For the roof, Samuel used a method that combined traditional timber framing with earth covering. He laid heavy timber beams across the space, running from the stone front wall back to the rear of the excavation, where they were anchored into the undisturbed earth of the hillside. These beams were cottonwood logs, 12 inches in diameter, hauled from the creek bottom with considerable effort. He spaced them 2 feet apart, creating a strong structural framework. Across these main beams, he laid smaller poles perpendicular, creating a tight grid. Over the poles he placed a layer of prairie grass thatch, tightly bundled and laid in overlapping rows like shingles. This thatch layer was about 6 inches thick. It would serve as a barrier between the timber structure and the earth that would go on top. Over the thatch, Samuel piled earth, not random dirt, but carefully selected clay-rich soil that he'd set aside during the excavation. He piled it thick, creating a layer that was 3 feet deep at the lowest point near the front wall and graduated to nearly 5 feet deep at the back, where it blended into the hillside. This earth layer was the key to the entire structure. 3 to 5 feet of soil provided tremendous insulation, far more than any conventional cabin wall could offer. But more than that, it provided thermal mass. The soil would moderate temperature swings, staying cool in summer and relatively warm in winter. As he worked, Samuel compacted the soil carefully, tamping it down to prevent settling that could damage the structure below. Over the final layer of earth, he planted grass. He scattered seeds from native prairie grass across the entire roof surface. Within weeks, the grass germinated and began to grow. The roots would bind the soil together, preventing erosion. Within a few months, the roof would be indistinguishable from the hillside around it. The cabin would literally disappear into the landscape. By late June, the basic structure was complete. From the outside, it looked almost like a conventional cabin, with its stone front wall, door, and windows. But from the side or from above, it was clear this was something different. The structure melted into the hillside. Only the front wall stood free. The rest was earth. Inside, Samuel completed the finishing work. He built a stone floor using the same creek stones that had gone into the front wall. He set them in sand, creating a surface that was level and solid. Stone flooring had several advantages. It was durable, easy to clean, and most importantly, it provided additional thermal mass. The stone floor would absorb heat during the day and release it slowly at night. He built a fireplace and chimney into the center of the stone front wall. The firebox was large enough to burn substantial pieces of wood, and he built it with an angled back wall that would reflect heat into the room. The chimney was stone, rising through the earth roof and extending 4 feet above the grass-covered surface. He topped it with a simple stone cap to keep rain out. The fireplace was a relatively conventional element, but its placement was strategic. Because the structure was so well insulated, Samuel knew he wouldn't need much heat. A small fire would be sufficient even on the coldest nights. For furniture, Samuel kept things simple. He built a bed frame into the northeast corner, essentially a wooden platform that kept the bedding off the floor. He built shelves into the earthen walls, cutting recesses and lining them with boards. He constructed a simple table and 2 chairs from cottonwood. He installed hooks along the walls for hanging tools and clothing. By early July, 3 months after he'd started, Samuel Whitmore moved into his earth-sheltered cabin. The cost breakdown was revealing. The glass for the windows was his single biggest expense at $12. The lime for mortar and whitewash cost $3. Nails and hardware cost $2. The door hinges and latch cost $1. Everything else, the stone, the timber, the earth, the grass, the labor, was free. Total cash outlay, $18. Compare that to a conventional timber cabin which required either purchasing lumber or spending weeks hauling logs, then weeks more notching and stacking them. A basic log cabin in Kansas in 1876 cost between $50 and $100 in materials and labor, assuming you did the work yourself. Hiring help could double that cost. Samuel's neighbors didn't know his costs, but they knew his cabin looked strange. And strange meant wrong. The criticism intensified when people actually visited. "It's dark," they'd say, standing in the doorway. And they were right. Compared to a cabin with windows on multiple walls, Samuel's cabin, with its 2 south-facing windows, was dimmer. But Samuel had planned for this. The lime-washed walls reflected light effectively. The windows were positioned to maximize the low-angle winter sun, and honestly, most homesteaders spent their daylight hours working outside. The cabin was for sleeping, eating, and sheltering from weather. It didn't need to be brilliantly lit. "It smells like dirt," others complained, and again, they were correct. The cabin had a distinctive earthy smell, especially when it rained. But it didn't smell bad. It smelled like soil, like the earth itself. Samuel found it pleasant. It smelled like safety, like permanence. "The walls will collapse," the skeptics predicted. "You'll be buried alive in there." This was perhaps the most common fear. The idea of living under tons of earth frightened people who were used to wooden walls they could see and trust. Samuel would patiently explain that the structure was sound, that the timber framing supported the roof load, that the sidewalls were cut at stable angles. But fear isn't rational. People remained convinced that his cabin was a death trap waiting to collapse. The criticism reached its peak in August when a government land agent came through to inspect homestead improvements. The Homestead Act required settlers to build a dwelling and cultivate a certain amount of land to prove up their claims. There were minimum standards for the dwelling, and the agent's job was to verify compliance. The agent, a man named Horace Pemberton, stood in front of Samuel's cabin with his notebook, frowning. "This is your dwelling?" he asked. "It is," Samuel confirmed. "The requirement is for a habitable structure of at least 10 feet by 12 feet with a door and at least one window." "I'm aware of the requirements," Samuel said, "and I've exceeded them. The interior is 16 feet by 24 feet. I have a door and 2 windows." Pemberton walked around the structure, examining it from all angles. He went inside, looked around, made notes. Finally, he came back out, still frowning. "I've never seen anything like this," he said. "Is it a house or a root cellar?" "It's a house," Samuel said firmly. "I live here." "It meets all the requirements." Pemberton chewed on his pencil. "I suppose technically it does, but I'm not sure this is what the Act intended." "The Act intended to settle the land," Samuel replied, "to turn it into productive farms. That's what I'm doing. The specific construction method of the dwelling isn't specified beyond the minimum requirements, which I've met." Pemberton couldn't argue with that. Reluctantly, he marked Samuel's claim as compliant, but as he rode away he shook his head. He'd be talking about the crazy hermit in the hillside for years. If you're enjoying this story about Samuel's innovative approach to homestead building and want to see more content about forgotten frontier wisdom and survival techniques, hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you don't miss future videos. Now let's see what happened when the real test came, the brutal Kansas winter. Summer on the Kansas prairie was brutal. The temperature regularly exceeded 95 degrees Fahrenheit. On the worst days, it topped 100. The sun blazed down from a cloudless sky, the wind blew constantly, but instead of cooling, it felt like the breath of a furnace. Conventional cabins became ovens. The log walls and wooden roofs absorbed heat all day and released it all night. Inside, temperatures often exceeded 90 degrees even after dark. Settlers slept outside when they could, spreading bedrolls in whatever shade they could find. Samuel's cabin was different. The thick earth layer on the roof never got hot. The grass covering reflected sunlight. The soil beneath absorbed what heat did penetrate, but 3 to 5 feet of earth is a tremendous insulator. The heat simply couldn't transfer through fast enough to affect the interior. Inside the cabin, even on the hottest August days when the outside temperature was 100 degrees, the interior temperature stayed at 68 degrees, a full 32 degrees cooler. Samuel didn't sleep outside. He slept comfortably in his bed, sometimes even needing a light blanket at night. People noticed. Jacob Sterling, the neighbor who'd first mocked Samuel's digging, stopped by one afternoon in late August. The temperature outside was 97 degrees. Sterling was drenched in sweat. His face was red. He looked exhausted. "Mind if I come in for a minute?" he asked. "I've been checking fence lines all day, and I'm about cooked." "Come in," Samuel said, stepping aside. Sterling entered the cabin and stopped. The temperature difference was immediate and shocking. He stood there, feeling the cool air, and his expression changed from heat-induced misery to astonishment. "How?" he asked. "How is it this cool in here?" "Earth," Samuel said simply. 3 to 5 feet of it above our heads. It doesn't change temperature quickly. Right now, it's still cool from winter. Come December, it'll still be warm from summer." Sterling walked around the interior, examining the walls, the ceiling, the stone floor. He put his hand against the earthen wall and felt the cool, solid surface. "I'll be damned," he said softly. "You actually knew what you were doing." "Tried to tell you," Samuel said, but without smugness. "I know, I didn't listen. None of us did." Sterling sat down at the table without being invited, grateful for the cool refuge. "How hot does it get in here on the worst days?" "Haven't seen it above 70, Samuel replied. Sterling thought about his own cabin, where the temperature regularly hit 90. where his wife had suffered through the summer, where his children whined constantly about the heat, where sleep was nearly impossible. "And in winter?" he asked. "How cold?" "Don't know yet," Samuel admitted. "But if it stays as stable as I expect, probably around 55 to 60 degrees, even without a fire." "That's warmer than my cabin gets with the fire going," Sterling said. He sat there a while longer, cooling off, thinking. Then he asked, "Would you help me build one? Next summer, after harvest. I want to build a cabin like this." "Of course," Samuel said. And that was the beginning. Sterling wasn't the only one to notice the remarkable temperature stability of Samuel's earth-sheltered cabin. Word spread. Other homesteaders found excuses to visit, to feel the cool interior for themselves. They'd stand inside, marveling at the comfort, then go back to their sweltering cabins and wonder why they'd been so quick to mock. But the real test was still coming. Summer was impressive, certainly, but Kansas winters were the true killer. The first snow came in late October. It was light, just a dusting that melted by noon, but it was a warning. Winter was coming. Samuel spent the autumn preparing. He cut and stacked firewood, though he expected to need far less than a conventional cabin would require. He reinforced the door with additional weather stripping, sealing every gap. He checked the chimney for cracks. He stocked his small root cellar, which he dug even deeper, into the hillside, with potatoes, turnips, and other vegetables. He was ready. November brought cold rain and occasional snow. December brought serious cold. The temperature dropped below zero for the first time on December 15th. It stayed below zero for 3 days. The wind screamed across the prairie at 40 miles per hour, driving the wind chill far lower. In conventional cabins across the prairie, homesteaders huddled around their fireplaces, burning wood as fast as they could split it. The wind found every gap in the chinking, every crack around windows and doors. The cold penetrated the single-layer log walls almost as if they weren't there. Inside temperatures in most cabins dropped into the 30s and low 40s despite roaring fires. People slept in their clothes, under every blanket they owned, and still shivered. In Samuel's cabin, the interior temperature was 58 degrees, without a fire. He'd built a small fire that morning, more for cooking than heating. The fire had warmed the interior to 62 degrees. When the fire died down to coals around noon, the temperature slowly drifted down to 58 and stayed there. The thick earth roof and walls simply didn't allow heat to escape quickly, and they didn't allow cold to penetrate. The temperature differential between the outside air at 10 below zero and the interior at 58 degrees was 68 degrees. 68 degrees of protection provided by soil, stone, and smart design. On December 20th, Jacob Sterling fought through knee-deep snow to reach Samuel's cabin. He pounded on the door. Samuel opened it to find Sterling shivering violently, his face pale, his lips blue. "My fire went out," Sterling said through chattering teeth. "Lost the embers somehow. I can't get it restarted. My hands are too cold. Can you help?" "Come inside," Samuel said immediately, pulling Sterling in. The warmth, relative though it was, felt like a furnace to Sterling, who'd been struggling in a cabin that had dropped to 20 degrees. Samuel sat him near the fireplace, added wood to bring the fire up, and wrapped Sterling in a blanket. "Stay here until you warm up," Samuel said. "Then I'll go back with you and help restart your fire." Sterling sat there, gradually regaining color, gradually stopping his shaking. Finally, he said, "It's 55, 60 degrees in here?" "About that," Samuel confirmed. "And you haven't had a fire going all day?" "Not really, just coals." Sterling looked around the cabin as if seeing it for the first time. "My cabin's at 20 degrees with a fire I've been feeding constantly for 2 days. Your cabin's at 60 with no fire. That's a 40-degree difference." "More or less," Samuel agreed. "Probably closer to 45 or 50 degrees warmer than outside, depending on wind chill." Sterling was quiet for a long time. Then he said, I'm sorry. For what? For mocking you. For calling you a fool. For telling everyone you were wasting your time. Samuel shrugged. You thought what you thought. Most people agreed with you. But you were right, and we were all wrong. I had different information, Samuel said. I'd seen Earth temperature stability in the mines. You hadn't. Doesn't make you wrong for not knowing something you'd never seen. The winter of 1876 to 1877 was harsh, but not record-breaking. It was a typical Kansas winter, cold, windy, with heavy snowstorms that buried the prairie for days at a time. For settlers in conventional cabins, it was a struggle. They burned enormous quantities of firewood. They fought constantly to maintain barely tolerable interior temperatures. They suffered. Samuel burned approximately 1/10 the firewood of his neighbors. He maintained interior temperatures that were comfortable, with minimal effort. He didn't suffer. By February, as word spread about the performance of his earth-sheltered cabin, Samuel received visits from homesteaders from across the county. They wanted to see it for themselves. They wanted to understand how it worked. And increasingly, they wanted his help building their own. Samuel became an informal consultant. He'd explain the principles: Earth's temperature stability, thermal mass, insulation values, passive solar orientation. He'd emphasize that this wasn't magic or luck. It was physics. Heat moves from hot to cold. The rate of heat transfer depends on the insulation value of the material between them. Earth has a moderate insulation value, but when you use 3 to 5 feet of it, the cumulative effect is dramatic. He'd explain thermal mass. Materials like stone and soil absorb heat slowly and release it slowly, moderating temperature swings. He'd explain passive solar design, orienting the structure to capture low-angle winter sun while shading from high-angle summer sun. He'd explain that these principles were ancient, tested by thousands of years of human habitation. The technology was as old as civilization itself. Spring came, and with it, a building boom. Jacob Sterling began excavating his own hillside in April. 2 other families started similar projects. By summer, there were 5 earth-sheltered cabins under construction in the county. Samuel helped with all of them, sharing his knowledge freely. He didn't charge money. He considered it neighborly duty, but he did accept payment in the form of help with his own projects, shared meals, and the social capital of being recognized as the expert. Not everyone was convinced. Many homesteaders stuck with conventional construction. Some because they didn't have suitable hillsides on their claims, others because they simply couldn't overcome their psychological resistance to living partially underground. And that was fine. Samuel never claimed his method was the only way, or even the best way, for everyone. It was simply the best way for him and for others who prioritized thermal stability and energy efficiency. By 1878, Samuel had proved up his claim. He received the patent for his 160 acres, making him the legal owner. The government inspector who came for the final review was not Horace Pemberton, but a different agent, a younger man named William Brooks. Brooks examined the earth-sheltered cabin with great interest. "This is unusual," he said. "Does it meet the dwelling requirements?" Samuel asked a bit wearily. He'd had this conversation before. "Oh, absolutely," Brooks assured him. "I'm just fascinated. I've read about similar structures in Europe and among indigenous peoples, but I've never seen one built by an American homesteader. How well does it work?" "See for yourself," Samuel said. It was a hot July day, over 95 degrees outside. Inside, the cabin was a comfortable 68 degrees. Brooks stood in the doorway, experiencing the temperature difference, and whistled softly. Remarkable. The savings in heating and cooling must be substantial. "I burn about 1/10 the firewood of a conventional cabin," Samuel confirmed, "and I've never been uncomfortable from heat in summer." "Have you considered publishing your methods?" Brooks asked, "helping spread this knowledge?" Samuel shrugged. "I help anyone who asks. But I'm not a writer. I'm a farmer." Brooks left, but he was true to his word. He wrote an article for a homesteading journal describing Samuel's cabin and its benefits. The article was published in early 1879 and was picked up by several other publications. Suddenly, Samuel Whitmore's earth-sheltered cabin was being discussed in homesteading societies across the Midwest. He received letters from Iowa, Nebraska, Colorado, even as far as California, asking for details and advice. Samuel answered what letters he could, but he found writing tedious. He was more comfortable with a shovel than a pen. The principles behind Samuel's cabin were straightforward, but they represented a deep understanding of thermal dynamics that most homesteaders lacked. First, earth temperature stability. Below the frost line, which in Kansas is approximately 36 inches, soil temperature remains relatively constant year-round. At depths of 6 to 8 feet, the temperature stays within a few degrees of the annual average air temperature, which in central Kansas is approximately 55 degrees Fahrenheit. By building into a hillside and covering the structure with several feet of earth, Samuel had effectively surrounded his living space with material that maintained a stable temperature. This stability moderated the interior temperature regardless of exterior conditions. Second, thermal mass. Soil and stone are high thermal mass materials. They absorb large amounts of heat energy with only modest temperature increases. Once heated or cooled, they maintain that temperature for extended periods. The thousands of pounds of earth covering Samuel's cabin absorbed heat during summer days and cold during winter nights. But the sheer mass meant the interior surface temperature changed very slowly. Third, insulation value. While earth is not as good an insulator as modern materials like fiberglass or foam, it's respectable. Soil has an R value, a measure of thermal resistance, of about 0.25 per inch for clay soil. This means each foot of earth provides an R value of 3. Samuel's roof with 3 to 5 feet of earth had an R value between 9 and 15. Compare this to a typical log wall, which might have an R value of 8 for the entire wall. Samuel's roof alone exceeded most cabin walls in insulation value, and his side walls, being excavated earth, provided even more. Fourth, passive solar design. By orienting the open face of the structure to the south and including windows, Samuel allowed winter sunlight to penetrate deep into the space. The low angle of the winter sun meant direct sunlight hit the back wall and floor, warming the thermal mass. In summer, when the sun was high in the sky, the overhang of the hillside above the windows provided natural shading, preventing excessive solar gain. Fifth, reduced air infiltration. A conventional cabin, with its many joints between logs and its door and window openings, allowed significant air leakage. Wind would push cold air in through one side and draw warm air out through the other. Samuel's cabin, with its solid earthen walls and single wall of door and windows, had far fewer opportunities for air infiltration. These principles combined to create a structure that required minimal heating in winter and no cooling in summer. The energy efficiency was extraordinary. In modern terms, Samuel had built what we would call a passive house or net zero energy building. He'd done it in 1876, using nothing but natural materials and careful observation. The social impact of Samuel's cabin extended beyond just building techniques. It challenged assumptions about what was proper, civilized, or acceptable. Homesteaders in the late 19th century were trying to recreate the civilization they'd left behind. They wanted proper houses that looked like the houses back east. The idea of building into the earth seemed like a step backward, like giving up on progress. Samuel's success forced people to reconsider. Maybe progress wasn't always about doing things the conventional way. Maybe innovation meant adapting to local conditions rather than imposing imported solutions. Maybe the indigenous people and ancient cultures who'd built earth-sheltered structures for thousands of years had been onto something. This was a radical thought, in an era that believed firmly in the superiority of European-American methods. The practical benefits couldn't be denied. Homesteaders who built earth-sheltered cabins reported dramatic improvements in quality of life. They slept better, they were healthier. They spent less time and energy on heating and cooling. They had more time for productive work because they weren't constantly cutting firewood or suffering from temperature extremes. These benefits attracted attention beyond the homesteading community. Architects began studying earth-sheltered design. Agricultural colleges included information about it in their extension programs. By the 1880s, earth-sheltered structures were being built not just by homesteaders, but by ranchers, farmers, and even some wealthy landowners who appreciated the energy efficiency. Samuel himself continued refining his design. In 1880, he expanded his cabin by excavating further into the hillside, adding a second room that served as a bedroom. This allowed him to keep the main room cleaner and more organized, with the fireplace and cooking area separate from sleeping. In 1882, he married. Her name was Elizabeth Hartman, the daughter of a homesteader family who'd settled 3 miles south. Elizabeth had visited Samuel's cabin several times with her family and had been impressed by its comfort and efficiency. She didn't mind the earthen walls or the unusual design. She understood the benefits. They raised 4 children in that earth-sheltered cabin. The children grew up thinking it was perfectly normal to live in a hill. They were healthier than many of their peers, protected from temperature extremes that contributed to illness in conventional homes. The cabin could be heated comfortably with a small fire even on the coldest nights, reducing the risk of respiratory problems from smoke and drafts. By 1890, there were over 30 earth-sheltered homes in the county. They ranged from simple dugouts, basically caves with front walls added, to sophisticated hybrid structures like Samuel's. The variety showed that builders were adapting the principles to their specific sites and needs. Some built into south-facing hillsides like Samuel. Others built into the sides of ravines or creek banks. A few even excavated into flat ground, creating bermed structures with earth piled around 3 sides. The technique spread beyond Kansas. Nebraska, with its scarcity of timber, became a hotbed of earth-sheltered construction. The famous sod houses of the Great Plains were essentially earth-sheltered structures with walls made of stacked sod bricks and roofs covered with more sod. While less sophisticated than Samuel's design, they operated on the same principles. In the southwestern territories, settlers combined earth-sheltered designs with adobe construction, creating homes that stayed cool in the brutal desert summer. Some innovations improved on Samuel's original design. Builders began using better waterproofing materials like tar paper or, later, asphalt roofing between the structural roof and the earth layer. This prevented moisture infiltration and extended the life of the wooden structure. They developed better ventilation systems, adding small windows or vents on opposite walls to promote air circulation. They experimented with different roof angles and overhangs to optimize passive solar gain and summer shading. By the turn of the 20th century, earth-sheltered construction was an established, if minority, building method on the Great Plains. It never became mainstream. Most people still preferred conventional above-ground houses. But it had proven itself as a viable alternative for those who prioritized energy efficiency and thermal comfort. Samuel Whitmore lived in his earth-sheltered cabin until 1912 when he was 70 years old. His children were grown and had moved away. He and Elizabeth decided to move to town, closer to their eldest daughter. They sold the homestead to a young couple who appreciated the cabin's benefits and promised to maintain it. The cabin stood for another 40 years. It survived droughts, blizzards, tornadoes that flattened conventional structures nearby. The earth covering protected it from wind damage. The solid construction prevented collapse. It was finally abandoned in the 1950s when the farm was consolidated into a larger operation and the new owners built a modern house on a different part of the property. The abandoned cabin gradually returned to the earth. The timber roof structure eventually rotted. The earth covering no longer supported, settled, and filled the interior. By the 1970s, only the stone front wall remained visible, a monument to Samuel's ingenuity. In 1982, a graduate student in architecture doing research on vernacular building methods tracked down the location of Samuel's cabin. She interviewed elderly residents who remembered it and reviewed historical documents. She excavated part of the site, documenting the construction details. Her thesis, published in 1984, brought renewed attention to Samuel's work. The timing was perfect. The energy crisis of the 1970s had sparked interest in energy-efficient building methods. Architects and builders were rediscovering techniques like passive solar design, thermal mass, and earth sheltering. Samuel's cabin, built over a century earlier, became a case study in sustainable design. If this story has inspired you to learn more about sustainable building practices, forgotten pioneer techniques, and alternative approaches to modern problems, make sure you're subscribed to this channel. We dive deep into historical innovations that are more relevant today than ever. Now, let's explore the lasting impact of Samuel's revolutionary cabin design. Modern earth-sheltered architecture owes a debt to pioneers like Samuel Whitmore, even if most architects have never heard of him. The principles he applied are now taught in architecture schools. The phrase earth-sheltered is now a recognized building category, with its own design guidelines and building codes. Research has confirmed what Samuel knew intuitively. A study by the University of Minnesota in the 1980s measured interior temperatures in earth-sheltered homes versus conventional homes over a full year. They found that earth-sheltered homes maintained interior temperatures within a 15 to 20 degree range with minimal heating and cooling, while conventional homes experienced temperature swings of 40 to 50 degrees and required constant energy input. The temperature difference that Samuel achieved, 47 degrees warmer than conventional cabins, has been replicated in modern measurements. Earth-sheltered homes in cold climates routinely maintain interior temperatures 40 to 50 degrees warmer than exterior temperatures with minimal heating. The thermal mass and insulation of the earth create a buffer that conventional construction cannot match without expensive modern materials and active heating systems. But earth-sheltered design faces challenges today that Samuel didn't encounter. Modern building codes, designed primarily for conventional above-ground construction, often don't accommodate earth-sheltered designs well. Building inspectors unfamiliar with the technique may reject plans or require expensive modifications. Mortgage lenders sometimes balk at financing earth-sheltered homes because they're considered non-standard or difficult to appraise. Homeowners associations and zoning boards may prohibit them based on aesthetic concerns or misunderstandings about what earth-sheltered construction entails. These barriers are ironic. Earth-sheltered homes are demonstrably more energy efficient, more durable, and safer in many natural disasters than conventional homes. They represent exactly the kind of sustainable, low-impact construction that communities claim to want. But they look different, they challenge assumptions, and so they face resistance, just as Samuel's cabin did in 1876. The parallels between Samuel's era and our own are striking. Samuel built his earth-sheltered cabin during a time of Western expansion and settlement, when people were trying to adapt to unfamiliar environments. We're living through a time of climate change and resource constraints, trying to adapt to an unstable future. Samuel faced mockery from neighbors who couldn't see past conventional wisdom. Modern earth-sheltered builders face skepticism from building officials and lenders who can't see past standard practices. Samuel proved his design through performance, surviving extreme heat and cold better than conventional structures. Modern earth-sheltered homes prove their worth through measured energy savings, often using 70 to 90% less energy for heating and cooling than conventional homes. The technology hasn't changed much. We use better waterproofing and insulation materials now. We have more sophisticated ventilation systems. We can calculate heat transfer and solar angles with computer programs. But the fundamental principles remain exactly what Samuel understood in 1876. Earth provides thermal mass and insulation. Passive solar design reduces heating needs. Smart orientation and design can create comfortable interior climates with minimal energy input. These aren't new ideas. They're ancient knowledge that we forgot in the rush to build quickly and cheaply with industrial materials and fossil fuel energy. We're relearning what Samuel and countless builders before him knew. The story of Samuel Whitmore's cabin carries lessons beyond architecture. It's a story about trusting your own observations and reasoning even when everyone disagrees. Samuel had seen stable earth temperatures in the mines. He'd studied the principles. He'd thought through the design. He knew it would work. The mockery of his neighbors couldn't change the physics. It's a story about the difference between short-term convenience and long-term benefit. Samuel spent 3 months building his cabin when he could have thrown up a conventional structure in 3 weeks. But those extra months of work provided decades of comfortable, energy-efficient living. It's a story about adapting to local conditions rather than imposing imported solutions. Kansas wasn't Pennsylvania or Virginia or wherever else the settlers had come from. It required different approaches. Samuel understood this and designed accordingly. It's a story about the value of knowledge from diverse sources. Samuel learned from coal mining, from reading about indigenous architecture, from talking to a German immigrant. He synthesized knowledge from multiple traditions to create something adapted to his specific situation. These lessons apply far beyond homesteading or building. They're about how we approach problems in general. Do we default to conventional wisdom even when it's not working? Do we mock innovations that seem strange? Do we take the time to do things right? Or do we cut corners for short-term savings? Do we adapt to our actual circumstances? Or do we try to force familiar solutions onto unfamiliar problems? Samuel's cabin also demonstrates the limits of technology as a solution to environmental challenges. We often assume that new problems require new technologies, but sometimes the solution is old knowledge applied carefully. Samuel didn't need modern materials or systems. He needed correct principles and careful execution. This isn't to say that modern technology has no value. Contemporary earth-sheltered homes benefit from improved materials and systems that Samuel couldn't access. But the core of the solution, the use of Earth's thermal properties to moderate interior temperature, was available to him just as it's available to us. The physical properties of soil haven't changed. The social resistance to earth-shelter design also hasn't changed much. People in Samuel's time thought living partially underground was primitive, uncivilized, a step backward. Many people today have the same reaction. The deep-rooted association between underground spaces and burial, poverty, or primitivism is hard to overcome. Yet, some of the most energy-efficient, comfortable, and beautiful homes being built today are earth-sheltered. They feature large windows, abundant natural light, modern amenities, and stunning interior spaces. They're not caves or bunkers. They're sophisticated designs that happen to use the earth as a building material and insulation source. They prove that earth-sheltered doesn't mean dark, damp, or depressing. It can mean bright, comfortable, and sustainable. Samuel Whitmore died in 1915 at the age of 73. His obituary in the local newspaper mentioned his pioneering role in homesteading the area, his service on the school board, and his successful farming operation. It didn't mention his cabin. By then, it was just an old earth-sheltered house that Samuel had lived in decades earlier. The innovation had become routine. The mockery had been forgotten. But Samuel's influence continued through the people who'd learned from him and the structures that remained. Jacob Sterling, the neighbor who'd first mocked Samuel and later became his friend and student, built an earth-sheltered barn in 1885. He used the same principles Samuel had demonstrated, creating a stable temperature space for storing crops and sheltering livestock. The barn stood until 1962. Sterling's son, who grew up visiting Samuel's cabin and playing with the Whitmore children, became a building contractor. He built several earth-sheltered structures in the 1920s and 30s. One, a storm shelter for a school, saved 30 lives when a tornado destroyed the school building in 1938. The people huddled in the earth-sheltered shelter were completely unharmed. That building contractor's grandson became an architect in the 1970s. Inspired by family stories about the old earth-sheltered houses, he specialized in energy-efficient design. He never met Samuel Whitmore, but his work carried forward the principles Samuel had demonstrated. The physical structure of Samuel's cabin may be gone, returned to the earth from which it was made, but the knowledge persists. The principles work just as well today as they did in 1876. Earth still provides thermal mass and insulation. Passive solar design still works. Careful attention to heat transfer, air infiltration, and moisture management still creates comfortable, efficient buildings. In our current era of climate change, energy costs, and environmental awareness, Samuel's approach is more relevant than ever. We need buildings that use less energy. We need designs that work with natural systems rather than fighting them. We need to reconsider assumptions about what buildings should look like and how they should function. The homesteaders who mocked Samuel's cabin were responding to their own assumptions and fears. They couldn't imagine living partially underground. They thought conventional cabins were the only proper choice. They were wrong, but they were wrong in a very human way. We all carry assumptions that limit our thinking. We all resist unfamiliar ideas. The question is whether we can recognize when our assumptions are wrong and adapt. Samuel's neighbors eventually did. Jacob Sterling admitted his mistake. Others followed Samuel's example. The community learned. We can too. The 47-degree temperature difference that gave this story its title wasn't just about comfort, though that mattered. It was about survival. It was about using resources wisely. It was about understanding and working with natural systems. It was about the difference between conventional wisdom and actual wisdom. Samuel Whitmore's cabin proved that sometimes the person everyone mocks is the one who sees most clearly, that the innovative solution is better than the familiar one, that knowledge and careful thought can outperform brute force and expensive materials, that adapting to your environment is smarter than fighting it. These are lessons that homesteaders learned on the Kansas prairie in the 1870s. Their lessons we're still learning today, and their lessons we'll keep needing to learn as we face new challenges and adapt to changing conditions. The story of Samuel's cabin, built into a hillside while neighbors laughed, staying 47 degrees warmer through physics and planning, is a story about the power of knowledge, the value of persistence, and the vindication that comes not from saying, "I told you so," but from simply building something that works and works well year after year, decade after decade, proving its worth through quiet, constant performance. That cabin is gone now, but its legacy remains in every earth-sheltered home that stays comfortable with minimal energy, in every builder who understands that the earth itself can be a building material and climate control system, in every person who questions conventional wisdom and looks for better solutions. Samuel Whitmore built a cabin that everyone mocked. Then it stayed 47 degrees warmer than their cabins, and in doing so, he taught a lesson that echoes across generations. Innovation often looks foolish until it proves itself, and the proof always is in the performance.